this lecture, we'll talk about the basics of moral theory. I'm going a little out of order for this lecture. We're going to talk about the first couple sections in Vaughn's reading about what is a moral theory and the classification types of theories. And then we're going to skip to the criteria for judging moral theories in between those two. You might think that it's pretty obvious what a moral theory is, but as we're trying to lay the groundwork here in the first couple of weeks, it's important to be precise with our language. So even though it might seem obvious, it's important to clarify how we are using these different terms so we can use them effectively to communicate what our ideas are. So a moral theory serves as the foundation to justify our claims about what actions and character traits we deem morally justifiable or morally redeemable or irredeemable. And as you've probably picked up at this point, I keep on saying actions that are right or wrong or personal character traits that are good or bad. Although we use right and wrong, good or bad quite interchangeably, it's just a good clarification point here that when we're doing a moral evaluation, we can talk about either the actions or we can talk about the person. So argument in favor of certain character traits doesn't necessarily override an evaluation of actions as either right or wrong. There are a number of different moral dimensions that we can evaluate, and it's important to understand that. Vaughan also talks about what moral theorizing is. So when we are changing moral theory into the verb, when we are doing the theorizing, we're making or using these different theories to articulate our arguments in one way or another. So you'll also see within some of the readings about theories of right action, these are the most prominent ones. So when we're talking about most ethical arguments, or moral arguments I should say, are geared towards actions. And although we'll talk about character traits quite a bit when it comes to virtue ethics and to a degree care ethics, most of the time when we are giving our moral arguments, we are geared towards these theories of right action, trying to discern what right and wrong actions are. Later in this chapter, I appreciate how Vaughan outlines these evaluation criteria to evaluate different moral theories for the claims that they posit. So the first criterion that he posits is consistency with our considered moral judgments. So hopefully you remember from last week that a considered moral judgment are those in which we deem plausible or credible after our careful reflection in the most unbiased way possible. So we want to, if a moral theory proposes a certain moral judgment and it doesn't sort of coincide with our considered moral judgment, then that might be a reason to call in to reject or dive into the moral argument further. So a moral theory must be consistent with the data it is supposed to explain. And here the data is our considered moral judgments, what we might call our moral common sense. So the first one is if a moral theory proposes a type of action as right that we inherently realize is wrong. So say a moral theory suggests that murdering is okay. Like I said, I know I keep on using this as an example. It's probably getting tiring, but it's a good one because inherently we understand that murdering is a wrong action, and if a moral theory proposes it, that seems to be grounds for rejecting that moral theory. The second criterion that Vaughan lists is consistency with the facts of moral life. And what he means here is that when a moral theory makes its claims, it should be consistent with what we expect when we are engaging with one another in the world. So he says experiences include making moral judgments, disagreeing with others on moral issues, being mistaken in our beliefs, and giving reasons for accepting moral beliefs. These are all experiences in which are part of our existence and our moral life. So if a theory denies some of these experiences, then it seems like that is a reason to call into question that theory. The third criterion is resourcefulness in moral problem solving. So ultimately, what are we doing ethics for? It's to help us solve moral problems in the world. It's not just a way in which we can justify being a better person than another or virtue signaling, right? We want our ethics to help us navigate a very complicated world. So here, I have a couple of examples, not real life examples. I'm just giving you these sort of suggestions about consider this moral theory. Let's call it moral theory X that says murder is allowed as long as you are really, really angry. That would seem to run counter to our considered moral judgment that murder is wrong, as I said before. So more than likely going to reject that theory on that basis there. So now let's imagine another moral theory, we'll call it moral theory Y, that says it is unnecessary to consider the interests of others. Well, this seems to violate the second criterion because part of the moral life is engaging with one another and taking into consideration interests beyond one set groups. If you remember from last week, we were talking about the 4 features of moral theories, and in there we have, of moral norms. I should fix that. Sorry. So you had normative dominance, you had universality, impartiality, and reasonableness. And so impartiality was no bias without a good moral reason to introduce that bias. And so here, moral theory Y is sort of lenient on that impartiality, or not upholding that feature that we expect insofar as the interests of others are not considered. That seems to be a basic tenet of every justifiable moral theory. Then finally, let's consider moral theory Z here. If it suggests that do the right thing in the right situation no matter what. Let's say that that's a maxim. That is a rule in which the theory suggests, well, this provides us no helpful insights in how to actually solve these moral problems. It just says do the right thing. And if life was as easy as just doing the right thing, then we wouldn't need ethics and have all these different arguments with one another about what is right and wrong. So again, I really like this section, which is later in the chapter, outlining these criteria. And so just keep them in mind as we are going through the different moral theories in the next lecture. Finally, let's differentiate these different types or classifications of moral theories. So here on the screen, you'll see this sort of chain that I usually like to put up and have these conversations about moral theories. So on the left side, you see motivation leads into an action, which then leads into a consequence. And so we're judging right and wrong actions. And there are 2 different ways to evaluate right and wrong action. If you evaluate it based on its motivation, and you're not as interested in the consequence of the action, you're concerned about, does this person have the proper motivation to do this action? That would be a non-consequentialism or a deontology, a duty-based ethics, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. But here we're just trying to distinguish prior to action and post-action evaluation of where we're centering our considerations here. So if we're concerned with the motivation, that's a non-consequentialism or deontology type ethics. And then if we are more concerned with the consequence over the motivation, then this is a consequentialism. So let's look at two examples to clarify why we make this distinction. So imagine that I want to be a really good friend and bake a cake for my friend's birthday. And I have all the intention of, I'm just going to spend the whole day getting all the ingredients, making sure that the frosting looks perfect, that it tastes great, and ultimately it gets everybody sick. Well, the motivation for that action to bake that cake was to make all my friends very happy. I had no desire to bring about the consequence of making them sick. My motivations were, again, to make my friends happy. So if we were to evaluate my action of baking this cake on a non-consequentialist take, well, we might say that this is a right action, that I acted in the right way, that maybe my actions were laudable. But if I'm a consequentialist, I'd say I don't really care about the motivations. You got everybody sick. And so that seems to be a wrong action, might be punishable, so on and so forth. Now, let's look at a different example. Imagine I saw a report online that there's going to be a shortage of ibuprofen, and that everybody's going to be wanting it. And so what I do is I go run around town and I buy all of the ibuprofen, and then I can mark it up and sell it back to everybody online to make extra money. It seems like, the whole idea behind this is to make more money for myself because people are going to have to buy this ibuprofen from me. Well, imagine the news report comes out next couple of days that somebody has put poison in all the ibuprofen. And now all the ibuprofen that I purchased is worth nothing. But I saved a ton of people from accidentally buying poison. It seems like in this case, if we're going to judge my motivations for my action of purchasing all of this ibuprofen, I was doing it for the wrong reasons. I was doing it so then I could make more money off of people in my community. And so the action would probably be judged wrong. But if we were to take a consequentialist view, hey, I saved a ton of people's lives. Give me an award, right? So here, if we are a consequentialist, my actions are defendable. They are good, or well, not good. Again, we'll make sure we're clarifying here. See, they can be very interchangeable, but I'm going to try to be more precise here. So the consequences would justify the action being right in a certain respect, even though my motivations we might consider poor. So that's the difference between non-consequentialism and consequentialism. Let's summarize what we discussed in this video. So first, a moral theory serves as the justification for moral claims. We require a moral theory for consistency's sake and to make different evaluations to posit different moral claims. And so when we are trying to justify our moral arguments, we typically appeal to a moral theory that produces these moral norms. A moral theory should, based on Vaughan's criteria, be consistent with our considered moral judgments, be consistent with the facts of a moral life, offer some guidance on how to be moral. And then just in the last slide, we were talking about consequentialism versus non-consequentialism. If you're a consequentialist, you care about the consequences and are not as invested in the motivations for an action. And if you're a non-consequentialist or a deontologist, you're more concerned with the motivations of an action rather than its consequences.